Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Steven Tipton, a visiting distinguished speaker for the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics at the University of Oregon. Steven Tipton is a professor of sociology of religion at the Candler School of Theology and in the Department of Sociology at Emory University. He earned his undergraduate degree at Stanford and his PhD at Harvard. He's the author of 3 books, including most recently, Public Pulpits, Methodists and Mainline Churches in the Moral Argument of Public Life, which is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. And his book, Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life, co-authored by Robert Bellah, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, published in 1985 and reissued in 2007. He's the co-author of another 2 books, and the co-editor of 3 more. While he is here in Oregon, he's going to be speaking on the place of religion in public life. A great topic, and it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me what compelled you to write this book on the influence of the role of the religious mainstream in public life, say, as opposed to the more radical fringes which so many people talk about.
God goes to Washington from the religious center, not just the religious right. So I went too because I was curious, most of all. And what came out of that is a kind of in-close, personal look at, if you will, religion and politics in the mainline churches. It's also a kind of intimate listening in to and talking with to mainline church leaders and activists as they argue over and struggle over how to live out our faith to save our souls and our society, to make a difference and to make a better world when it comes to peace and justice and a sustainable future for all of us. So, gee, what could be so controversial about those good things? Who's against that stuff? Now, when you say that means, as I take up the story, doing everything you can to oppose the invasion of Iraq while the drumbeat of the march to war was going on, and doing it with folks like MoveOn.org, not just the National Council of Churches, people may have some difference of opinion. When it means engaging, but very critically and carefully, faith-based initiatives and talking about what that might mean, especially insofar as it's couched in sort of highly individual kind of let's each one of us be like Mother Teresa, and then we won't have to pull the government into this matter. Let's touch those who are hurting and heal their pain, but maybe not worry about jobs and universal health care. Then people could say, hey, wait a minute, that's something that we have some differing view about that's no less faithful. So the book starts with those 2 issues and the mainline churches and the National Council of Churches, and particularly the Methodists, taking on in critical give and take the administration and lobbying Congress in particular against invading Iraq. It's also a story about Methodists struggling over the soul of their own church. So fighting, yes, over abortion, over the ordination of gays to the ministry, over, quote, gay rights and all kinds of other specific issues. But they're also fighting about what the church means as the body of Christ, as a connectional body, but also in political terms. Should congregations be free to make their own decisions about where they give their charitable donations, or should it all be swept away into the hands of exactly who? Faithful leaders in Washington, or kind of left-wing liberationist cannons rolling around on their own instead of being used not just to fix the church roof, but also to feed the hungry folks back in the food pantry. So those kinds of arguments and issues in the Methodist Church. As well as, well, what's so controversial about peace and justice and a better world? How could people be fighting over that?
So let me ask you, what were you most surprised about that you found?
everything's connected to everything else.
Uh-huh.
And that folks are not just fighting political battles along predictable lines, well, left wing, right wing, or center versus near right, that there is a lot of admixture and back and forth at every different level. So one of the things about the Methodist Church that's very striking is that folks, if you look at the numbers, are about equally divided, lay people, registered Republicans, registered Democrats, with maybe a quarter of all United Methodists or so in the middle. But all of them, almost all of them agreeing about all these sorts of overarching goods, the poor, race, ending discrimination, and so on. But Methodists on both sides are wired in a bunch of different other places. And mainline church folks in, quote, God Box in Washington on Capitol Hill, right across from the Capitol, they are talking with, collaborating with, and engaged sometimes in adversarial relations with a whole bunch of other folks inside the churches and outside. So there are a couple of chapters in the book about the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which in its own way is a work of genius and a kind of innovation that combined from the 1980s on a sort of fluent, persuasive, sometimes polemical religious lobby with a really potent political action group, and one that was engaged in fighting the Cold War vigorously, and then moved to culture wars kinds of fighting and persuasion. Some people talked about it as a seminary for the Reagan White House, and people involved with it have continued to exercise moral influence and example for the current administration.
So if you say it began in the Reagan White House, then it has a certain...
No, it didn't begin in the Reagan White House, but it began
At
during
the
the
time.
Reagan years.
So does it have that kind of Reagan-esque
well,
orientation?
The names matter back and forth. So from the outside, these might be folks who are typically seen as, quote, neoconservatives. From the inside, their emphasis is on moral character, the American creed, and the American way of life, and not being embarrassed to defend it. And also not feeling needlessly guilty about all the good that Americans have done in the world and all of the efforts that we've made, even when it hasn't turned out so well. So for example, even to the present, if you ask people, I mean now, what about Iraq? I mean, 1 in 20 Americans says, look, we're going to have to find some other way and probably some other person or administration to solve things. But if you ask people, were we right or wrong morally to get involved as we did, to invade, even if it was mismanaged and in some ways misbegotten, there's still plenty of folks on both sides. And yes, it is polarized in some predictable ways, even as people now agree that, yeah, too many lives, too many dollars, we need to find a way, even if our convictions and our commitments were morally good and admirable. So for the Institute on Religion and Democracy, it's actually rooted in a whole bunch of arguments, not only in the churches, but in the American labor movement, about anti-communism in particular, and American patriotism, and how we should work in the world. And then carried over into issues about feminism and ecology, and concerns about big or small government. So this is a kind of complex mosaic in which a lot of pieces are tied together, are linked together in ways that aren't always so neat or estimable. You're an English major. Think of Chekhov and the domino plot, where each piece fits together with the next. Not quite that way here a lot of the time. And part of the book is about the kind of difficulty of the mainline churches beyond this or that issue, like universal health care or Iraq, or back all the way to civil rights in Vietnam. Beyond this or that great issue, how do they actually collaborate, cooperate, converse? Can they get unified? And can they do more than say the right thing? That is, can they get out there do grassroots organizing, mobilize. And that's part of the story. There are efforts to do that from the mid-1970s through the 80s when it comes to hunger and poverty. A big group called Interfaith Impact, and how mainline church folks gave money, blood, sweat, and tears, and lots of efforts to try to tackle those things, especially during the Reagan years, where poverty issues, inequality, small farmers, including black farmers, all those issues came together, and that's a story of kind of great success for at least a time, and then a kind of unraveling and difficulty and disappointment in holding that together.
Well, let me ask you, since you say everything's connected, and you were surprised by how everything was connected, and we've got this issue today about church-state. You know, is that eroding, that wall between church and state? The way you present this, it seems so complicated and so all over the map in terms of ideological points of view and the ways in which religion and the government coincide, that perhaps, how did that make you feel about the general issue of church-state? I mean, in other words, the way it's presented in the media, it's usually the extreme groups that are the danger. But the way you're presenting it is, it's just sort of it's sort of equal opportunity. So how does that make you feel about the church-state divide? And
Okay, no one answer.
uh-huh.
So the separation of church and state as institutions is, relatively speaking, clear to most Americans intuitively. Maybe we leave aside First Amendment lawyers and the people who know the intricate legal history and case-by-case difficulty of these questions. But for most Americans, the idea of church and state intuitively means something like, institutionally, each is a body that should be governed by its own members, not governed by the other, that there should be no established church that is right there, if not on the throne, behind the throne, and telling government what to do, and government should not be bossing churches around or favoring one against others, and thereby discriminating against those who do not belong to that confession or to that church. So the kind of institutional picture of the distinctness of the two bodies, each governed by its own members, is clear enough.
Hence the Mormon issue with
yes, that's right.
With
Mr. Romney, and before that with Mr. Kennedy,
exactly.
who made clear that he could be a member of the Catholic Church, and he could also be a good American and would not be swayed by papal or any other authorities. All right, so the institutional question is intuitively clear. But the question about how faith enters into public and how faithful folks can and should be good citizens may not always be so clear. I want to come back to something that's really changed and made, in some ways, these questions harder to figure out in practice, even if we're clear about principle, by virtue of the fact that over the last generation or so, there's been an explosion of hundreds and hundreds of parachurch groups, that is, not tied to denominations, churches, synagogues, whatever in specific, but national organizations devoted to public and governmental affairs that are freestanding. So they have increased, 3, 4, or more fold since 1960. And their increase is dwarfed by the mushrooming of non-religious, but nonetheless moral advocacy groups that are para-party groups. So on both sides, you've got a lot of proliferation and interaction that's not specifically church on one side, and it's not specifically party on the other. And it's that interaction where drawing the kind of lines that need to be tight and bright enough is a very challenging kind of problem. I'm going to talk more about this tonight. And it's also a problem that is tied actually to the profoundly moral, even a little religion-like aspiration that motivates, that drives the expansion of American government, or has for most of the last century, which is to do social good, to extend human rights. Not just civil rights, the right to vote across lines of gender and race, but to extend social rights that enable all persons to experience and expand their own human potential. So not just benefits, entitlements, and who's fighting over what, but this whole question of extended regulation, administrative stay. The government should put its hands not to constrain citizens, but to lift them up when it comes to schooling, medical care, and so on. That actually changes the public square in some ways. It makes more of it public. It expands that. It also makes it more important. It tugs on how other institutions, if you will, seek to advance those causes or their own interests sometimes, or to check them. This is a matter of fighting over causes, not just who gets what and interests. And to some extent, it has made our public square more contested in moral terms. And it has made other institutions, religious, educational institutions, I don't need to tell you that when it comes to both money and mission, what schools, state schools included, do what they deserve from government, what they need to get on their own, all those kinds of issues come to the fore. And other institutions become more politicized and legalized in certain kinds of ways. That's part of what this parachurch stuff is about. And at the same time, you can see in certain ways, government becoming more moralized. Not just that sort of minimal civil rights, once upon a time, John Locke in 1800, government ought to run the army, take out the garbage, deliver the mail, and then let citizens go their own way. And the fact is, under both parties, under a bunch of different ideals of big or small government, government's expanded enormously, and there are underlying moral reasons for that, and it's made our public square more competitive. It has enabled those who are more resourceful, better connected, have more education in particular, as well as occupational clout, to do better. Most of the expansion of political participation and action over the last generation is up the social ladder. That's where most of the kind of single issue and moral advocacy action is. And further down, that is one of the places where religious communities, especially where church-going African Americans and lower middle class white evangelicals stand as exceptions to the rule of some lessened political participation, as well as maybe kind of moral disappointment in the failures of our expanded state to follow through and fulfill its goals fully. But there's a kind of ironic triumph that since the New Deal, we have a majority of Americans who are middle class. And for them, I mean, there's a real struggle to square their consciences and their interests in the name of the public interest when it comes to issues like economic inequality, to full coverage in medical care, to any number of other issues that we all share, and where it really makes a difference. And so the kind of promise of enlarging public conscience and enlightening our debates, our confusions when it comes to what's right for all of us, for the common weal, that's one of the things that, at least at their arguable best, these religious efforts in public can and do make a real difference, as well as, you know, more infighting, more division, more interaction between parachurch leaders and, in particular, adept political campaign managers to go and court the faithful with few holds barred because they're doing single issue arithmetic, they're aggregating constituencies, and the church folks, you know, or the parachurch folks really tempted on that front too. So we can think about drawing a brighter line, and there are efforts, including lawsuits and legislative efforts, to try to draw a brighter line between parachurch and paraparty groups doing that kind of collaboration. May not be culture wars, but, you know, it sure looks like media wars. Election eve, voter guide blitzes, and email campaigns, and so on. So, you know, trying to separate faithful moral guidance from partisan voter guides, that's not a bad thing to do. And maybe if you spot them getting political wolves out of their religious sheep's clothing and removing them from their tax exemptions too. But there's harder stuff about, you know, political parties. They themselves need to be morally strengthened. So they're not so much at the prey of individual media-driven campaigns. That the moral coherence of their platforms, compare both the Republican and the Democratic parties, say back to Taft and FDR, they should be embarrassed what they've got now.
Is that right?
The victim, I think,
You
the
think
victim
there's
of their
been
own campaigns.
And you think there's been definitely a narrowing, a
Absolutely.
specialized, a
Absolutely.
ceding of the moral ground?
Absolutely.
Well, let me come back to this moral issue, torture.
Okay.
This is probably off, not exactly what you
Go
were
ahead,
expecting
Steve.
to.
If
What
you're
you're expecting
thinking
to
about
listen
it,
to.
I want you to tell me about it.
Well, you talk about the religion and how religious communities are now affecting or have the potential of affecting public policy. On this issue of torture, was there any sort of religious input in this debate?
That's a good question. Religious input in the debate is one good way to formulate it. And it's a question that bears on any number of issues that may not be so straightforward, at least for most Americans. That is, across the board, synagogues, temples, churches, mosques, ashrams are quite good at speaking out, at witnessing, and this is particularly true for the mainline churches. In their terms, one question is, how can prophetic witness lead Americans to move from their pews to political and civic action? So not just a representative speaking out on behalf of this or that leadership or the board of Church and Society in the Methodist Church or the National Council, but to bring citizens morally moved and faithfully inspired to make clear to the White House if need be, but certainly to their own elected representatives that this is unconscionable. It's not just against the Geneva Convention or a bad idea when you turn the tables. It's against the Golden Rule. It's against love of neighbor. It's against just war theory. It's against all a constellation of teachings, including Islamic and Buddhist and other teachings about war and peace and the use of force and the like. So kind of what do you do, whether it's prophet or persuader or moral interlocutor, to bring people forward? And the mainline churches have had continuing questions for themselves about their moments of real success, but also the spottiness of that success, where they've been working for universal health care coverage for a generation. They were working very hard, the mainline churches, in 1992, 3, and 4 in behalf of universal coverage. It didn't have to be single payer or whatever. They felt that they were less than successful in bringing their own folks to bear when a push came to shove, when representatives could be moved by people, particularly in their own districts, even if they weren't in a position to listen to those speaking from on high from their public pulpits.
Well, let me ask you, if what you're saying is, as you said earlier, that the political parties have somehow ceded the moral issue, the moral issue that, and you have
they've narrowed. Steve,
okay, so they've narrowed it, and then you have all of these groups in Washington D.C. who are have affiliations with religion. I mean, perhaps there's too much of this stuff going on in Washington, and then the political parties somehow don't feel as though they need to take that. Maybe they're thinking of ethical issues as being somehow special interest kind of issues that are going to be dealt with by religious lobbyists, and so they don't deal with it as a sort of trans-religious moral issue. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think you're right on two scores. Again, maybe a lot easier to say than to do, but the notion not so much of bringing churches and denominations of all sorts on one side and parties on the other back together. No, we don't want to do that. But broadening and working on the coherence as communities of moral reflection and principle, political parties, so that their own platforms and principles are worked out coherently and powerfully enough to resist being taken over by this or that individual campaign or candidacy, which is in turn seeking, partly because the parties are narrower, the base may be more intense, so quote, playing to the base, but also then trying to aggregate those in the middle to get, 50% plus 1 or 1/10% in the middle of political independence. That, parties, if they are strengthened in their moral cohesion, they may not get a whole bunch more folks to come back in. I mean, that's a very difficult dynamic, but they are much less apt prey for individual campaigns, who in turn seek to make the most use they can of both para-party and para-church groups. So it's not just the swift boat vets. The 527 committees in the 2004 election cycle raised, $550 million more than either the Democratic or Republican National Committee. The Democrats actually raised more of that money from outside than the Republicans. Republicans may have used it better. And likewise, some folks in and outside the churches have said, well, gee, the Republican campaign was certainly better at making use of the parachurch groups. Those value voters, they made the difference. They were down on the ground. They at least delivered Ohio and Florida. Well, in fact, again, that is arguable. But part of the argument that's pretty clear is that parachurch groups, let alone churches, should not be engaged in providing, as church members or institutionally, the resources to win elections on the ground. Again, that church-state separation and, as it were, church-party voting block separation is pretty clear. But making it work out in practice is a challenge, partly because of the landscape in which we live. And so the legalizing and politicizing of this kind of parachurch penumbra around religious bodies themselves is part of it. And part of it is that many of these para-party groups, freestanding single-issue groups, are themselves more engaged in moral argument, persuasion, inspiration. And some of that, of course, most of us would feel, whichever we pick, to be a good. That is, well, I may not like this or that pro-life group, but I'm certainly for the Sierra Club or Common Cause. I may not like the Heritage Foundation, but I'm certainly for Brookings. They're just doing research. And on the para-church group side, and this has been the case for at least 20 years, and there's good evidence for it, that if you look at who belongs to this or that para-church group compared to who belongs to a synagogue, mosque, temple, or Methodist congregation, you see, usually predictably, that the para-church groups are much narrower. That is, you can use liberal conservative kind of cultural labels and say, yes, the cultural conservatives, who are typically older and less educated, tend to be in the anti-abortion groups, tend to be in the anti-gay marriage groups. The younger and better educated, quote, cultural liberals tend to be those who are working for environmental justice, gender equality, the rights of women, and so on. So that makes them more volatile themselves, and typically they have more predictably partisan issue affiliations. It's better for people to pray together, to have covered dish suppers together, and to have to live with one another, even though they're Democrats, Republicans, and have different political views. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. We're out of time, I'm afraid.
Been a pleasure.
Okay. We've been speaking with Steven Tipton, Distinguished Speaker for the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics. Thanks very much for watching.